E a gente começa essa edição mostrando agora de manhã a greve geral.
Brazil's first general strike in more than 20 years has ended in violence.
No decorrer da manhã, vários pontos aí com interdições.
Agora começou a confusão, policiais de um lado atirando bombas de efeito.
Class and race dictate how people view the government reforms.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The protesters in Brazil are back, but it's a different story, a different government, and a different kind of coverage. An Iranian TV executive whose channel is based outside the country beaming in is shot and killed in Turkey. Chechnya, where the journalism story goes from bad to worse. And the online buzz that ensues when young journalists quit their jobs at BuzzFeed.
At BuzzFeed, one brain has to do it all.
Last week, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians took to the streets, and millions more stayed home in a general strike. Much of South America's biggest, most populous country was brought to a standstill, with airports, factories, schools, public services all shut down. If this story sounds familiar, it should, because last year, a different set of protests brought down a different government, that of former President Dilma Rousseff. But last year's demonstrations got wall-to-wall coverage in Brazil's privately owned news outlets, including Globo, which is as dominant a TV presence as you will find in any country. The subsequent impeachment of Rousseff paved the way for current President Michel Temer, whose austerity-based response to an economic recession led to the general strike. But this time around, Globo and others don't seem to find the protest story quite so compelling. Critics are suggesting that's because right-wing media outlets prefer Temer and his austerity program to Rousseff, her leftist predecessor, Lula da Silva, and the social programs that they brought in. Another factor might be that Michel Temer's government has been using taxpayers' money to persuade the news media to support his conservative agenda. Our starting point this week is São Paulo. Thursday, April 27th, business as usual on the Brazilian airwaves. On the eve of a national strike that would paralyze much of the country, the next day's demonstrations, already planned and with the media notified, are treated as a non-story.
It wasn't only a lack of coverage prior to the strike, it was also the fact that they covered the strike as if it was just something that was organized by the unions. Only unionized workers stopped, and the other workers that stopped was against their will.
Muitas pessoas que moram nas capitais não conseguiram chegar ao trabalho.
And on top of that, always associated with violence and rioting.
Os manifestantes começaram a jogar objetos na polícia militar.
So that's a constant frame in Brazilian media.
There was 24 hours coverage, but strikers and demonstrators were never interviewed. Our arguments for the general strike were never heard. The mainstream media clearly had an editorial tendency to discredit the strike.
Pequeno grupo de vândalos ateou pedras e também furou os pneus de ônibus de viagem.
Showing pictures of disorderly conduct without telling people the real reasons behind it.
Eu acho que discordo pouco disso aí.
I disagree with this. I also don't think that it was a general strike. It was a union strike, because some of the reforms are affecting the corporatist interests of the unions. You can't take the fact that someone did not go to work as support for the strike. That person did not stay at home because he wanted to strike. It was simply that he was unable to get to work.
Conseguiu chegar ao trabalho.
That was last week, but rewind to last year, and another set of protests to which the media took a very different approach.
Dá tempinho na cobertura do esporte. Vamos falar das manifestações que acontecem pelo país.
Back then, the demonstrations and the story were driven by an anti-corruption investigation involving the energy sector that would lead to the downfall of Dilma Rousseff, and an ongoing fraud investigation against the president who preceded her, Lula da Silva. The general strike was the culmination of the labor movement's resistance to the Temer government's austerity program, which includes cuts to pensions and public services. The anti-graft marches went on for a full year, providing an ongoing narrative. The general strike lasted just one day, but with teachers, doctors, nurses, and bus drivers among those taking part, it was the largest such strike in Brazil for decades, and was backed by protests in 26 states. The two stories are not the same, but nor are they as different as the contrasting coverage that they receive.
The gulf in coverage is vast. The protests calling for impeachment against the Dilma government had huge visibility, with Globo's helicopter capturing the protest from the air and covering it all day long. With protests against Michel Temer, this doesn't exist. When it came to the general strike,
durante todo o dia, o jornalismo da Rede Globo cobriu a paralisação por todo o Brasil.
The word strike was avoided. They talk only about demonstrations, protests and vandalism.
Many channels and programs, they are able to produce a coverage of an event like, the strike, where you have clearly two sides to it and only give voice to one side. That's amazing. Media in Brazil is an oligopoly. It's dominated by a few groups.
TV presenters, as well as journalists, are being co-opted to support the reforms. Silvia Santos, who is the biggest, perhaps the most popular TV presenter in the country, was summoned to meet with President Temer. They met, and on the next day, SBT, Santos's channel, started to broadcast messages like, "Did you know that if the reforms don't happen, you might not receive your salary?"
The media story in Brazil starts with Grupo Globo, the largest mass media company in Latin America. It owns 122 TV stations nationwide, TV networks, radio networks, major newspapers, and cable TV systems. Like Globo, Brazil's other major networks, SBT and Rede Record, are family-owned or controlled. Their proprietors tend to, politically, tilt to the right, which is reflected in the coverage their platforms provide.
There is a stigma against Rede Globo. I don't know why. It's a reaction to Globo's type of coverage. Globo has commercial interests and covers or doesn't cover events in a certain way or gives more space to this or that. It is up to them to decide. They are commercially motivated, as they should be.
Globo has a clear tendency to take sides politically. We know that their main financiers, their main advertisers, are the big banks, the automobile companies. Multinational corporations, in tandem with the Temer government, are pushing for the weakening of the state, opening Brazil up to privatization, liberalizing markets, and loosening regulations. So there are very powerful economic players influencing the narrative.
And the Temer government is making it in the media's economic interest to support its policies. While preaching austerity and the need for economic and social reforms, the government boosted what it spends on advertising by 65% immediately after Temer came to power. That's according to Brazil's leading financial newspaper, Estadão.
The Temer government is buying editorial support. It's not simply increasing advertising funds, no, it's exchanging advertising funds for editorial support. They are already thinking about 2018, about the next elections.
If it's proven, if there is a clear channeling of funds to the media to get more favorable coverage of these government proposals, I think it would be rather promiscuous. I think it would be wrong for the government to do this.
With multiple investigations into corruption, economic reforms affecting future pension checks, state spending on advertising, and where that money goes, the Brazilian political story is a complicated one. The story of the media reporting on it really isn't. Basically, it's what happens when news outlets that are supposed to reflect a multicultural, multifaceted society, such as Brazil's, are owned by and reflect the interests of one slice of that same society.
The mainstream media groups in Brazil are dominated by white men from rich families who pass it from father to son, and the bias reflected in their companies is towards that section of society. There is very little space for minorities, for the working class, for other narratives. It's always the elite speaking to the people with their own bias and worldview.
So if you want to give it a class reading, you can say that You know, they really silence the voices of the poor, the ones that they are getting hit the most by the economic crisis. They don't have a voice. What is not being represented is exactly the organized part of Brazilian society that opposes Temer.
Other media stories that are on our radar. It's been less than a month since we reported on the war against journalism in Mexico. Since then, 2 more journalists have been killed, making it a total of 5 this year. On April 29th, Filiberto Alvarez, a radio host in the central state of Morelos, was gunned down as he was leaving his station. 2 weeks earlier, Maximino Rodriguez Palacios, who covered police investigations and organized crime for the news website Colectivo Pericu, was shot dead in his car in La Paz. Mexican media workers have long contended that journalists' killings that go unpunished are a byproduct of collusion between criminal organizations, many of them involved in the drug trade, and the Mexican authorities. The founder and CEO of a popular Persian-language satellite television network, one that operates outside of Iran and beams its programming into the country, has been shot dead in Istanbul. Saeed Karimian, the Iranian owner of Gem TV, and his Kuwaiti business partner were reportedly shot dead by 2 masked men April 29th. Gem, which is based in Dubai, is not a news channel. It features entertainment programming, much of it Western in origin and dubbed into Persian. However, the Iranian authorities still disapprove of it. Last year, Karimian was tried in absentia by a Tehran court for spreading propaganda, found guilty, and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Turkish police have suggested the shooting may have been related to a financial disagreement involving the media mogul, but family members have reportedly said that Karimian had been recently threatened by the Iranian authorities. That underlying subplot in Pakistani politics, the power struggle between the military and the civilian-led government there, has been exposed again over a story that started with a news leak 6 months ago and continues to make news. Last October, the country's most widely read English-language newspaper, Dawn, reported on a closed-door meeting in which the Pakistani military was warned to collaborate with the civilian government in tackling terrorism. That story was immediately dismissed by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's office as a, quote, amalgamation of fiction and fabrication, unquote. Information Minister Pervez Rashid was fired for not preventing the publication of the piece. The army, however, demanded an inquiry into who might have leaked the information. Last week, after the inquiry concluded, the Prime Minister fired his top foreign policy advisor, Tariq Fatemi. He also referred the journalist who wrote the story, Cyril Almeida, and Dawn's editor, Zafar Abbas, to the All-Pakistan Newspaper Society for necessary disciplinary action. The army, however, made it clear it was not satisfied. In a tweet, the spokesperson for the army openly rejected the Prime Minister's measures. The rift between the Pakistani military and the government is rarely this public. Journalists in Pakistan are watching to see how it all plays out and the effect that it may have on the news media. 2 months back, we did a piece on journalism in Chechnya under President Ramzan Kadyrov, who the Paris-based media watchdog Reporters Without Borders has called a predator of press freedom. There have been developments since, so we're going to go back to that story. Kadyrov is an authoritarian leader who followed his father into the president's office and recently celebrated his 10th year in power. The Kadyrov's political rise came after they abandoned the idea of Chechen independence, over which 2 brutal wars were fought in the 1990s, and made their deal with Moscow and Vladimir Putin. Since then, the capital, Grozny, has been rebuilt with some shiny new towers, but a free press no longer exists. And the few journalists still reporting on human rights do so at their peril. At least 2 have paid with their lives. Recently, another journalist who we interviewed for this report, Elena Milashina, who works for the Russian paper Novaya Gazeta, was forced to stop her reporting trips into Chechnya, has fled her house in Moscow, and is reportedly in hiding. Her investigation into an alleged anti-homosexual purge by the Chechen authorities has led to public calls for the massacre of journalists. The Listening Post's Johanna Husnow on the challenges of reporting in Chechnya.
Over the past 2 years, Chechens have witnessed a series of disturbing spectacles unfold on their state television channel, Grozny TV. Ordinary Chechens accused of insulting the state and its leaders online are made to apologize, live, on air, to the head of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Kadyrov.
Everyone also knows the case of Adam Dikayev, the young man who dared to make jokes about government propaganda. He was made to apologize on camera in his underwear. In another case, a woman posted criticism against Kadyrov on social media. She and her husband were taken to the Grozny TV studio. They were humiliated and had to ask Ramzan Kadyrov for forgiveness.
These people are pressured to refute their words publicly, and undoubtedly this is aimed at terrifying the Chechen population. The shame and humiliation applies the sort of pressure that direct violence would. This is part of the campaign by Chechen authorities to ensure they are always depicted positively. You have to write about the authorities as you would about the departed, either good or nothing at all.
Ramzan Kadyrov has ruled Chechnya since 2007 and has succeeded in eliminating any space for dissent. Critical media have been silenced, and the outlets that do still operate in the Republic all have to toe the government's line. The internet is one of the few remaining places where Chechens can voice any dissatisfaction with the state. However, increasingly, even the internet has been squeezed. And for Chechen audiences, there are precious few outlets or platforms for alternative narratives.
The treatment of Kadyrov in the local media is very similar to the treatment of Putin in the Russian national media. If he says something, that is the news.
За игрой пристально наблюдал и главный болельщик, глава республики.
And if he doesn't say something, well, there isn't much going on. Kadyrov is a very colourful man, and he does lots of things that journalists love. He hangs out with A-list Hollywood stars, he has a pet tiger. Underneath that, in terms of actual day-to-day journalism, he's been catastrophic. The government is keen to present anyone who is critical of the government as an enemy. If you are a Chechen and you try to work as an independent journalist, you will be warned off, and if you continue, you will be hurt, and if you continue, you'll be killed.
The journalists who have remained in the Chechen Republic work as pro-government propagandists. If any independent observer watches TV or reads newspapers in the Chechen Republic, he will see similarities, not even to late communism, but to Stalin's times, when the only thing permitted was to praise, as though everything is perfect.
We contacted numerous Chechen officials and news outlets to hear from them about the state of the news media in the Republic. No one responded to our interview requests. The last outpost of critical journalists has become Russia. The Moscow-based newspaper Novaya Gazeta and a site called Caucasian Not are two of the few news outlets still reporting abuses in Chechnya. They do this work at considerable risk to themselves. Kadyrov continuously attacks critical Russian journalists via state media or through his social media accounts, and in some cases, it hasn't ended at just threats. In 2006, Novaya Gazeta's prominent Chechnya reporter, Anna Politkovskaya, was shot dead in her home in Moscow, reportedly on the orders of the Chechen authorities. 3 years later, her colleague, Natalia Estemirova, who wrote extensively on Chechen human rights abuses, was kidnapped in the Republic's capital Grozny and murdered.
The current Chechen regime has a long history of liquidating its critics, so threats are not the worst that can happen. The regime has built a reputation that is willing to solve all problems with violence. While this is alarming, it's not completely effective. It doesn't stop all non-Chechen journalists from writing on Chechnya. We at Novaya Gazeta and colleagues at Caucasian Not continue to cover abuses in Chechnya, and it makes the authorities there really angry, especially since we have a lot of journalistic credibility.
Just how angry Chechen authorities can get with journalists became clear last month. Soon after we interviewed Elena Milashina and aired our report in March, Novaya Gazeta published a story by her, documenting the disappearances and torture of gay men by the Chechen authorities. The Kadyrov government dismissed the story as untrue, claiming the state could not possibly torture homosexuals because none exist in the republic. Chechen clerics closely tied to the government announced a jihad on Novaya Gazeta's journalists. It was broadcast on Grozny TV. Milashina was forced to flee her home in Moscow and go into hiding. She spoke with us from an undisclosed location.
Kadyrov is very used to impunity for anything he did, and he truly believes that no matter what he did and what he does and what he will do, he will get away with this. I want just to prove the fact that if you want to get rid of the problem killing journalists, there will be always another journalist who come and will continue this work. And we just can't stop helping Chechen people, stop being their voice because they're silent. And if something happened with me, I taking the steps, and actually I'm taking them for several years, that some other people in my newspaper will continue my work.
The Kadyrov family owes its rise to power to a political decision taken by Ramzan Kadyrov's father, Ahmad Kadyrov. During the Second Chechen War in 1999, Kadyrov Sr. abandoned the separatist cause in exchange for a deal with the Russians. Ever since then, Moscow has propped up the Chechen state, and the Kadyrovs have been keen to manage their media image, not just at home, but in Russia as well.
There's an element of constantly reinforcing himself to a Russian audience. Most Russians, certainly Russian nationalists, don't like him. He is seen as receiving way too much money from the centre. He is elevated, he's the hero of Russia, despite the fact that he previously fought against Russia. So by stressing his loyalty, he's saying, look, I'm on your side. I personally think it's a bit of an act. Kadyrov is loyal to Kadyrov.
This constant demonstration of loyalty to Putin is a way to ensure he can do whatever he wants in Chechnya. And what has Putin done? He has permitted Kadyrov to build up his military forces. The Chechen state suppresses separatist movement and consolidates Russian power in the republic. Kadyrov is part of Moscow's Chechnya strategy, but what Putin didn't notice along the way is how de facto an independent regime came into existence.
After 2 devastating wars and nearly 20 years of Kadyrov rule, Chechnya has rehabilitated itself somewhat. The capital Grozny is peppered with shiny new buildings, but the city's gleaming surface doesn't quite hide the political shambles the republic is in. Ordinary Chechens have no political agency, the media climate is oppressive, and there's an ongoing insurgency carrying on the fight against the Russian state. Chechnya has hundreds of news stories going untold, and the leader of the republic, Ramzan Kadyrov, is making sure it stays that way.
Finally, be careful what you wish for. Executives and editors at BuzzFeed have a formula. They tell their producers to make video content that audiences can relate to, often with a personal touch. What they did not see coming was a trend of their former employees doing that, producing videos entitled "Why I Left BuzzFeed," and then throwing them up on YouTube. Now, some older, more time-worn, more cynical journalists might look at these videos and tell the millennials who produced them that their reasons for quitting are not unique to BuzzFeed. The problems they're talking about are industry-wide. Perhaps the kids are a little naive. To which the dearly departed would respond, pointing at their YouTube viewing figures in the millions, whatever. We leave you with a compilation of Why I Left BuzzFeed videos, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
I'm okay leaving BuzzFeed because I wanted to be making more long-form narrative stuff.
So the overarching reason why I left BuzzFeed is to have independence.
In a lot of cases, quantity trumps quality. They would rather have more videos than fewer good videos.
Small sets have dozens of brains. Large sets have 50, hundreds, even 1,000. At BuzzFeed, one brain has to do it all.
But eventually, you know, I got a little tired.
You see, when you're creating new videos every single week, you start to get a little bit tired. justify it because it's getting clicked on. But yeah, I want to create big things.
And at the same time, I started to feel like there wasn't necessarily a path for me at BuzzFeed, and part of that was because it was unclear what a path might look like.
What you think is your dream job or what you think is the best thing in the world might not always be your path, and that's okay.